And here we can see Muhammad Adil has managed to actually create an emulator on this emulator that is loaded through Star Wars Racer Revenge. He has access to the PlayStation Store. So he is on the latest firmware on the PS5. He loads up Star Wars Racer Revenge, runs the Luac0re exploit as usual, and then sends over a payload, a Lua payload for the emulator. And that starts up the emulator on the PS5. And here we can see he has access to a bunch of his games. So he loads up a bunch of these different showing them working on the PS5. So that's just a little example of what you can do using this exploit. Stand alone, even without the kernel exploit, we'll be able to use it to run emulators and like hopefully more powerful emulators in the future. Maybe something like Luac0re could be ported, so that you'll be able to run lots from many different systems, all from one emulator essentially. So that would be great. And then of course, maybe being able to run games from even more demanding emulators in the future. And maybe even PS4 games might be possible in the future to be loaded using this. So yeah, definitely cool to see that we already have an emulator working here, using this exploit working on the latest firmware for the PS5. So that's why I would recommend, if you're on the latest firmware on the PS5 already, and it might be a good idea to pick up a copy of Racer Revenge, so just in case PlayStation try and do something to add friction to being able to get this game the latest firmware. I would definitely recommend getting it sooner rather than later. If you want to be able to run emulators interesting and things on your PS5 in the future. So that's what's possible just with the exploit standalone, of course. We can also chain it with the poops kernel exploit to be able to jailbreak the PS5 up to firmware 12.00, as that's the maximum firmware that the kernel exploit works on. So for that, you would require a physical copy of the game. Whereas if you're on the latest just using the exploit standalone, you can get the digital version. But to be able to load it on an older firmware like 12.0, you need a physical copy of the game, which of course is very difficult to get a hold of. But in terms of development, I've already gone ahead and showed you. And this exploit running up to the ELF loader. So you can actually get the ELF loader and then use it to jailbreak the console, as I demonstrated on my 10.0 system. But we now have a video one-upping this from Luac0re, who is showing it running on 12.0, where he has actually gone through and ported Kstuff Lite to work on 12.0. So we can see when he loads up the Star Wars Racer Revenge game on his 12.0 system, it is showing he is on firmware 12.0. He then sends the kernel exploit as a Lua file to execute on the console, and then runs the ELF loader. And then he goes ahead and sends a couple of the Luac0re payload, and of course Kstuff Lite also being loaded. As you can see there, it shows Kstuff running on firmware 12.0. He then goes ahead and installs a PS4 fake package file from the package installer in the debug settings, and then successfully loads it on his console as well, proving that the entire jailbreak chain is effectively done. We have the kernel exploit able to be loaded using the Luac0re exploit, the ELF loader, and then also the Kstuff payload, which was the last thing needed to be able to run your PS. For fake packages, PlayStation 5 and game certain homebrew applications that require Kstuff, that is now effectively done. And Luac0re has stated in this particular video, I'll leave linked down in the description, he did state that he is essentially done porting Kstuff from firmware 10.20 all the way up to 12.0. But for the most part, it seems to be more or less complete from all firmware, from 10.20 all the way up to 12.0. Once we have the kernel exploit fully released, we also have a bunch of that have also been ported to work up to 12.0. There is the FTP server payload, the game dumping payload, the PUB decryptor, and the web server payload, as well as the offline account activator. So all of those payloads have been ported to work up to the latest firmware. And it's particularly useful with the game dumper, because one of the things that benefits everybody who has a jailbroken PS5, even if you're on an older jailbreak, you still benefit from this new 12.0 jailbreak for the PS5, because it means we can dump newer PlayStation 5 games and turn them into working backups, which can then be backported using Best Pig's backport payload, which will then allow you to run those newer games on older firmware. So up until now, we've only been able to dump games up to about October of 2024. Because after that point, games started requiring higher firmwares than 10.0, the latest jailbreakable firmware. So we weren't able to dump any of those newer games. But now, of course, that we have a jailbreak up to 12.0, effectively with the dumping payload able to dump our games, we can now dump games up to about October of 2025. So that's a whole year of PlayStation PlayStation 5 games that can now be dumped and turned into playable backups that can be backported to work on older firmware that we previously did not have access to. And we're already seeing a couple of those games be released already. Like, for example, we already have Gears of War Reloaded and Clear. Obscure's Expedition 33. That's a big one, and also, of course, Metal Gear. Solid Snake Eater as well. And there's other games that came out in 2025, like Ghost of Utah, that may also get ported eventually. Although some games, of course, require fixes before they can be released. So we can probably expect to see a lot more games as well now that we have a jailbreak up to 12.00. So that's something that can benefit even people running older jailbreaks. When new jailbreaks come out for higher firmware, you're able to run a lot more PS5 games that were not playable previously. Now there's also some rumblings about potentially being able to use other methods to jailbreak. Up to 12.00. Star Wars Racer Revenge might not be the only option in future. So coming to us from Zico here, who says that contrary to popular belief, it seems that Star Wars Revenge is the seemingly only way to exploit 12.00 and below until 10.20 with poop splat. There are other ways, which have been completely patched with the release of 13.00. Then goes on to say that from 1.5.3, I think they finally fixed the good old user pref bug found by Andy. The flow, where you can run any compressed classes by just opening the object. Here they probably checked that the compressed thing should not contain executable classes. So he basically says BD jailbreak should be viable on the PS5. So still very early days on this. But if something significant with the Blu-ray drive was patched in 13.00 then, if there was anybody holding onto some kind of exploit or vulnerability that could be exploited, and up till this point, they might have been keeping it private because it wasn't patched now yet. That it has been patched, there's no real reason to keep it private. And then those kind of things can then be released. That's typically what you see. So if there was some kind of Blu-ray drive vulnerability patched in 13.00 that some developers might have been sitting on while it was still vulnerable on the latest firmware, there is a good chance that they might now release that. So that we might have another way to jailbreak up to 12.00. But at the moment, there's very little information about this so far. So I would take this with a grain of salt for now. We also saw the release of BD Not Jailbreak by Gajane. So this, of course, is just the jar loader for the Blu-ray exploit without the sandbox escape, so that it can work up to the latest firmware. It's not a jailbreaker, really a proper exploit. It's more just something that can be used by developers to test different vulnerabilities on different firmwares. And it's now been updated to support the latest firmware on the PS. Maybe another indication of potential vulnerabilities being tested on higher firmwares. And last but not least, a little bit of progress update on Void Shell version 3.0, which has been highly anticipated. So we've got from Void Whisperer a couple of additional features that he posted about in recent days, including avatar changer. So within Void Shell, you'll be able to easily swap out your profile on your account, so that is going to be added in the next version, along with an integrated app dumper that is going to be applied. Now, you can already use the app pretty conveniently with the current version of Void Shell by simply adding the payload into the payload loader, and then you can just send that payload from the web panel whenever you want to dump a game. But it's pretty cool that it's now gonna have proper integration, so you'll be able to use that to dump your games from now on. And it even gives you some stats as it's dumping the games, and on the actual web panel, which is pretty cool. So it's not just showing it on the console. You can actually just look at the web panel to see the game dump. Void just makes everything so much more convenient once you have it set up. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this quick update. Found the information useful. If you did, please